name is Ren. I am 28 years old and I run a small bakery out of a converted garage in Asheville, North Carolina. The flour gets under my fingernails and I never fully get rid of the smell of brown butter, and I would not trade any of it for anything. But that is not where this story starts. This story starts in a boardroom on the 42nd floor of a glass building in Charlotte, where I sat across a mahogany table from the two people who raised me and watched them realize that everything they had spent 30 years building was about to go to me. My mother smoothed her blazer. My brother checked his phone under the table like he thought no one could see him. They were both smiling, that particular smile, the one that said they already knew how this would go, that they had already spent the money in their heads, that I was still the same 22-year-old they had pushed out the door, and they fully expected me to fold. They had no idea what my grandmother had done. They had no idea she had seen all of it. Every single thing. Before I tell you how it ended, let me tell you how it started. Because the ending only makes sense if you understand the beginning. My grandmother, Frances Alderton, built Alderton Home Goods from a single linen closet's worth of inventory and a folding table at a craft fair in Raleigh in 1974. By the time I was born, it was a regional chain with 14 stores across the Carolinas and Georgia. By the time I was 12, it had been featured in Southern Living twice, and she had declined 3 acquisition offers from national retailers because, as she told me once over sweet tea on her back porch, she did not trust anyone who wore a tie to a casual conversation. She was that kind of woman. Blunt, particular. She wore her white hair short and her opinions long. She called my father Richard's friend for the first 4 years of my parents' marriage because she said any man who introduced himself by his golf handicap needed to earn a name. I adored her completely. My mother, whose name is Patrice, married into the Alderton name and spent the next 30 years trying to own it. She was not a bad person in the way that obvious villains are bad. She was bad in the quieter, more domestic way. The kind of bad that happens over 1,000 small moments. 1,000 tiny comparisons. 1,000 times she looked at me and looked at my brother and made a choice about which one mattered more. My brother's name is Brett. Brett is 3 years older than me and built like someone who peaked in high school lacrosse and has been coasting on it ever since. He is loud in the way that gets mistaken for confidence. He fills rooms with noise, and my parents always called it charisma. When Brett was 16, he totaled my grandmother's second car, the one she kept at her lake house. He had taken it without asking. He drove it into a drainage ditch off Highway 64. Nobody was hurt, but the car was gone, and my parents sat him down that night and told him that mistakes were how men learned. My grandmother paid for the car to be towed and said nothing directly to Brett, but she watched my mother hug him at the kitchen table, and something passed behind her eyes that I did not understand until much later. When I was 15, I borrowed my mother's car to drive to my shift at the bookstore where I worked part-time. I was a good driver. I made it there and back without incident. But I had not asked first, and when my mother found out, I was grounded for 2 weeks, and my father told me I had a problem with respecting other people's property. I did not point out the discrepancy. I had already learned that pointing out discrepancies made me difficult. That was the word they used for me. Difficult. Oversensitive. Too serious. My mother would say these things with a kind of affectionate exasperation, like I was a weather pattern she had learned to dress for. She never said them with cruelty exactly. She just said them often enough that I began to understand they were how she actually saw me. Brett was the one. I was the also. He went to UNC Chapel Hill. My parents drove him up in September of his freshman year, and my mother cried at the dorm room door. I watched from the car because there was not enough room in the moment for both of them and also me, and I had figured out by then how to make myself smaller in spaces that didn't have room for me. When I was 17 and applying to colleges, my father sat me down at the dining room table. He had a spreadsheet open on his laptop. He had done the math, he said. Between Brett's tuition and his apartment and his study abroad program, there was not a lot left over. He wasn't saying no. He was just being realistic. Had I considered community college? 2 years local and then transferring was a very practical path. Some of the most successful people he knew had taken that route. I asked if Brett had been offered the community college conversation. My father closed the laptop and said I was being ungrateful. I went to App State on a partial academic scholarship and 3 different small grants I applied for myself. I worked at a coffee shop 20 hours a week. I called my grandmother every Sunday. She asked me detailed questions about my classes and my professors, and she listened to my answers like they mattered. She was the only person in my family who asked follow-up questions. Junior year, I took a food science elective because I needed a lab credit, and I ended up sitting next to a woman named Odette who made her own sourdough and talked about fermentation with the same energy other people use to talk about religion. Something opened up in me in that class. I started baking at 2 in the morning in the dormitory kitchen and leaving things on the common room counter and going to class. I started reading about small business ownership. I started thinking about what it might feel like to build something that was mine. I told my mother about it over Christmas break. She listened with the patient expression she used when she was waiting for me to finish talking. "Ren," she said, "you are a smart girl. Don't waste that on cupcakes." I graduated in May. I moved to Asheville because a friend of mine from school had a garage apartment available and the rent was low enough that I could work and save and experiment. I spent 2 years doing exactly that. Working at a restaurant during the day and baking at night and slowly figuring out what I was doing. I opened Ren's Crumb in a converted garage space in March of my 25th year. I had enough money for 6 months of runway. I had a used commercial oven, a secondhand display case, and a menu of 8 things. My parents did not come to the opening. Brett sent a gif of a thumbs up emoji. My grandmother drove 4 hours from her house in Wilmington with a lemon cake she had made herself. She sat at my one small table and ate a piece of my brown butter shortbread, and she put her fork down and said, "This is real, Ren. This is the real thing." She said it the way people say things they mean completely. She started calling me every Wednesday. She asked about revenue and margins and customer counts. She sent me an article about small business financing and then called me back the next day to discuss it. She told me about the early years of Alderton's, the ones nobody talked about, the years before it worked, when she was driving product to stores in a station wagon with a broken AC and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. "I knew it was going to be okay," she told me once, "when I stopped needing other people to tell me it was going to be okay." "You're almost there." I didn't fully understand what she meant until later. My brother, in those same years, was doing what Brett did. He had joined the family business, by which I mean he had joined my grandmother's company, because Patrice had maneuvered herself onto the board after my grandfather died and my father had been given a VP title that meant something on paper. Brett came in as a regional director at 26. He talked about it like he had earned it. He had not. He showed up to the office in nice clothes and left early on Fridays and told people he was building his leadership skills. He called me twice in 3 years. Once to ask if I could make 60 cupcakes for his girlfriend's birthday for free because family discount, and once to tell me that Grandma Frances seemed off lately and I should probably check on her since I had more flexibility in my schedule. That second call was in October. I drove to Wilmington the following weekend. She was not off. She was tired. There is a difference. She had slowed down in the way that people slow down when they are 81 years old and have been going at full speed for 6 decades. She was still sharp. She still knew exactly what she was doing. But she was quieter than usual, and she held my hand when I got up to leave, and she said, "Come back soon." I started coming back every 3 weeks. I would bring things from the bakery, the brown butter shortbread, a small loaf of rosemary olive oil bread, whatever was working that week. We would sit in her sunroom and drink coffee and talk. She asked about my grandmother's recipes, the ones her own mother had made. I started writing them down. My mother found out I was visiting and called to say that was very sweet of me and it must be nice to have so much free time. I told her the bakery was doing well enough that I had hired a part-time employee. She said that was great and changed the subject to Brett's promotion. 6 months later, my grandmother's nurse called me at 6 in the morning. Her name was Petra and she was one of the most competent people I've ever encountered, and the steadiness in her voice was the only thing that kept me from coming apart completely on that phone call. She said I should come now, and I did. I drove 4 hours with my hands tight on the steering wheel and the radio off. She was still alive when I got there. Barely. I sat on the edge of her bed and held her hand and told her about the new menu item I was testing, a cardamom honey tart. And I don't know if she heard me, but she squeezed my hand twice and that felt like enough. She passed 2 hours later, just past noon, on a Thursday in November with the light coming through the window at that low afternoon angle that makes everything look like it's made of gold. My parents arrived at 4 o'clock. They came in a rented Lincoln. They were dressed like they were attending a charity gala. My mother hugged me with both arms and smelled like her expensive perfume and said, "Oh, Ren," in a voice calibrated to sound devastated. My father shook hands with the hospice coordinator. Brett walked through the house slowly, the way you walk through a place you're thinking of purchasing. "Did she say anything?" he asked me. At the end. "She said goodbye," I told him. It wasn't entirely true, it was close enough. The next 2 weeks were my mother's production. She arranged a funeral at First Presbyterian in Wilmington that seated 300 people. She selected the flowers. She wrote the obituary, which mentioned my father's involvement in the company 11 times and Brett's regional director title 6 times, and referred to me as Ren Alderton, who runs a small food business in the Asheville area. She stood at the front of the church accepting condolences with her hand on my father's arm like they were hosting a cocktail party. I sat in the third row. I wore my grandmother's silver earrings, the ones she had worn every day for as long as I could remember. Nobody mentioned them. Nobody noticed. After the service, my mother took me aside. She held both of my hands and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Something that was trying very hard to look like warmth. "We want you to come home for a while," she said. "Family should be together at a time like this. Besides, the reading is next week." She squeezed my hands. "Your grandmother loved you, Ren. I'm sure there's something for you. We can help you manage whatever it is. You have so much on your plate with the bakery." I looked at her. I understood exactly what this was. She didn't know what was in the will. She wanted to make sure I was close enough to be managed. She had watched me for 28 years and she had concluded, still, that I was the one who would be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they redirected my way, that a little warmth after a long drought would make me compliant. I thanked her for the offer and told her I would be fine at the hotel. Her expression flickered. Just for a second. Then the warmth came back. "Of course," she said. "Whatever you need." The law offices of Hatcher, Byrne and Walsh occupied the 5th floor of a brick building in downtown Wilmington that smelled like old carpet and central air conditioning. There was a conference room with a long table and 6 chairs and a window that looked out at the Cape Fear River, gray and flat in the November light. I sat on one side. My parents and Brett sat on the other. My father had his phone face down on the table. My mother had her hands folded. Brett had a legal pad and a pen and kept clicking the pen open and closed, until my father put a hand on his arm. The attorney's name was Mr. Calloway. He had been my grandmother's lawyer for 26 years. He was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that comes from having seen a great many things and having learned that patience was more useful than noise. He did not smile when we came in. He looked at me from across the table and gave a small single nod, and I held on to that nod for the next 40 minutes. "We'll begin," Mr. Calloway said. He opened a document binder. He went through the standard language, the declarations of competency, the revocations of competency, the revocations of prior instruments. My mother leaned forward almost imperceptibly. My brother's pen clicking stopped. "The total value of the estate," Mr. Calloway said, looking at a separate page, "including the Alderton Home Goods business interests, the commercial property portfolio, the Wilmington residential property, investment accounts, and liquid assets, is currently appraised at approximately $4.2 million. My mother let out a breath. My father's shoulders dropped in a way that looked like relief. Brett actually smiled. I watched them calculate. $4.2 million between the family, maybe $1 million each, maybe more if things split the way they expected. Enough to matter. Enough to be worth showing up for. To my son-in-law, Mr. Calloway read, "I leave the set of Waterford crystal in the dining room hutch, which he has always admired and which I hope he will use for something other than impressing people he doesn't actually like." My father went still. "To my grandson Brett, Mr. Bread," Calloway continued, "I leave the sum of $10,000 to be used at his discretion, along with my sincere hope that he will one day discover that the size of a room does not change based on how loudly you speak in it. Brett's pen fell off the table, and to my granddaughter, Wren Frances Alderton, I heard my own name and felt my chest lock. I leave the entirety of the remaining estate. This includes full ownership of the Alderton Home Goods business interests, the commercial properties in New Hanover and Brunswick counties, the Wilmington residence, all investment accounts, and all liquid assets. It is my intention that she receive this without condition, without oversight, and without interference. The room was silent for long enough that I could hear the ventilation system running. Then my mother said, "That's not right." Her voice was very controlled, carefully controlled. Frances would not have done this without discussing it with the family first. This has to be an older document. There must be a more recent version. This document was executed 8 months ago, Mr. Calloway said. Mrs. Alderton had full capacity at the time of signing. It was witnessed and notarized according to all applicable North Carolina statutes. This is the operative will. She was not well, my father said. His voice was getting the particular flatness it got when he was working to stay composed. In her final months, she was not herself. She was being influenced by whom? Mr. Calloway asked. A pause. By circumstances, my father said. By proximity, Wren was there constantly. That kind of access, Mr. Alderton, my mother corrected quietly. His name isn't Alderton, I thought. He married into it. My client was explicit about this scenario, Mr. Calloway said. He turned a page. She anticipated that the distribution might be challenged. She was, as I said, a very specific woman. She asked me to read the following passage aloud if that challenge arose. I'll do so now. He lifted a single sheet of paper. I could see from across the table that it was handwritten. My grandmother's handwriting, that familiar, looping cursive that had signed my birthday cards every year since I could remember. I have spent 50 years watching people treat money like it was the same thing as character. It is not. I built Aldertons from nothing, and I know exactly what nothing looks like, and I know exactly what it costs. Wren knows what it costs. She built her own business with her own hands, while my daughter-in-law called it cupcakes, and my grandson asked her for free samples. She drove to Wilmington every 3 weeks for 2 years to sit with me. She brought me cardamom tarts and wrote down my mother's recipes and asked me questions about 1974 like those years mattered. They did matter. She is the only one who understood that. The company goes to Wren. The house goes to Wren. Everything I built goes to the person who understands what building actually is. If anyone disputes this, I have taken steps to ensure they will not be successful. I love my family. I know exactly who they are. Wren, run it well. You already know how. Mr. Calloway set the paper down. Brett was the first to speak. He looked at me across the table, and the calculation in his expression gave way to something that was trying to look like hurt. Wren, he said, come on, we're family. Grandma was old. She wasn't thinking clearly about you can't actually. I have a mortgage, Wren. I have a car payment. You're seriously going to sit there and, I'm going to sit here, I said, and let Mr. Calloway finish. The document also includes Mr. Calloway finish. Calloway said, adjusting his glasses, a protective clause. In the event that any party named in this will initiates legal proceedings to contest the distribution, files for any form of guardianship or conservatorship over the beneficiary, or applies any form of financial, professional, or personal pressure intended to coerce the beneficiary into restructuring the estate, the following consequences take effect automatically. He looked at my parents. The $10,000 bequest to Brett Alderton is revoked. A formal complaint is filed with the North Carolina State Bar regarding the professional conduct of any attorney representing the contesting party, based on documentation Mrs. Alderton maintained. And a packet of correspondence, including emails, financial records, and a recorded phone conversation, is released to the Charlotte Business Journal. My mother's face did something I had never seen it do before. The composure just left, like a light switching off. What correspondence? She said. I couldn't say, Mr. Calloway said pleasantly. I've never opened the packet. My father pushed back from the table. He was using the voice now, the one that had stopped conversations for 30 years. the one that meant the discussion was over because he had decided it was over. "This is not finished," he said. "We'll be speaking with our own attorney." "That is entirely your right," Mr. Calloway said. "I'd encourage you to read Clause 7 first. They left. My mother walked out without looking at me. My father followed her, one hand on her back, steering her like he was guiding her away from something unpleasant. Brett stopped at the door. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the frame. "I always thought we were close," he said. "I thought about the gift. I thought about the 60 cupcakes. I thought about the 60 cupcakes. I thought about the phone call telling me to check on grandmother because I had more flexibility. I'll have to think about whether that's true," I said. He left. I sat there for a while after they were gone. Mr. Calloway refilled my water glass from a pitcher on the credenza and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Outside the window, the river was still gray. A pelican was sitting on a piling. I watched it for a while. They filed suit 6 weeks later. My parents had found an attorney in Charlotte who specialized in will contests, an aggressive man whose name was on billboards near the airport. They claimed diminished capacity. They claimed undue influence. My mother gave an interview to a local lifestyle blog, not even a real news outlet, a lifestyle blog, saying that she was heartbroken to have to pursue this, and that she was only thinking of Frances's legacy and what she truly would have wanted. My grandmother, I thought, would have had something extremely specific to say about that. I didn't give interviews. I hired my own attorney, a woman in Wilmington named Miss Okafor, who had worked in estate litigation for 20 years, and who wore her natural hair in a high puff and had a handshake that meant business. "Let them talk," she told me on our first call. "We're going to let the evidence do the talking instead." The hearing was in February. The courtroom was small. Not the dramatic high-ceilinged kind you see in movies, but a regular county courtroom with fluorescent lights and wooden benches, and a judge who looked like she had heard everything before and found almost none of it interesting. My parents sat with their Charlotte attorney. They looked like they had dressed for a different kind of proceeding, something more formal and more winning. Brett was there too, in a blazer, sitting beside them. Their attorney went first. He was a skilled speaker. He talked about my grandmother's declining health. He talked about my pattern of visiting and the access it created. He said the words isolated and dependent and susceptible in close proximity. He called my mother to the stand and she cried, real tears I think, though I am not sure what she was crying about. She said she loved Frances. She said she was scared for her mother-in-law in those final months. She said she had tried to visit more, but she had responsibilities. Then Ms. Okafor stood up. She was not loud. She moved slowly and deliberately, and the room got quiet around her in the way rooms get quiet when someone knows exactly what they're doing. "I'd like to submit Exhibit A," she said. It was a medical report, compiled by my grandmother's primary physician, her cardiologist, and a neurologist who had evaluated her 6 months before the will was executed. All three had independently noted that Frances Alderton was in full cognitive possession of her faculties. The neurologist had given her a standard cognitive assessment. She had scored in the 93rd percentile for her age group. In the margin of his notes, he had written, "Patient corrected me on a point of local Wilmington history. She was right." The courtroom was quiet. "Exhibit B, Ms. Okafor said. It was a log. The log that Petra, the nurse, had kept. Dates and times of all visitors to the Wilmington residence in the final 2 years. It was thorough because Petra was thorough. It was the kind of document that did not lie because it had not been made to be shown to anyone. In the final 24 months of Frances Alderton's life, I had visited 47 times. I had attended 11 medical appointments with her. I had been present for 3 conversations with her estate attorney. My parents had visited 4 times. All 4 visits had been on holidays. The longest had lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The others had been shorter. Brett had visited twice. Ms. Okafor let the judge look at the log for a long moment before she continued. "Exhibit C," she said. It was an email chain between my mother and my father, dated 16 months before my grandmother died. I had not known it existed until Miss Okafor found it in the discovery process. My mother had written to my father, "We need to make sure we're positioned correctly before Frances gets any worse. I don't trust Wren being down there all the time. She's always been good at playing the long game." My father had written back, Agreed. Let's get down there this weekend and reassess. They had not gone that weekend. They had not gone for another 4 months. The judge? Her name was Judge Parsons, and she had short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain and an expression that had probably not changed since 2009, looked at the email. Then she looked at my parents. Then she looked at the exhibit log. "I've heard enough," she said. She did not say it loudly. She said it in the tone of someone who has been presented with information that makes a very simple picture and who has no patience for the continued pretense that the picture is complicated. "This petition is dismissed," she said. "The will of Francis Alderton stands in its entirety. I would further note for the record that the evidence presented suggests the petitioners were far more concerned with their own financial positioning than with the well-being of the decedent. That is not a basis for a will contest. It is, however, a basis for a great deal of personal reflection." She took off her glasses. "Court is adjourned." My parents' attorney was already leaning in to speak to my father in a low voice. Brett had his phone out. My mother was looking at the table in front of her. I walked out. The February air was cold and salt-smelling, the way Wilmington air always is. Ms. Okafor walked beside me to the parking lot and we shook hands and she said, "Call me next week and we'll talk through the transition steps." Then she got in her car and left, and I stood there alone for a minute in the quiet. I did not feel like celebrating. That surprised me a little. I had spent 6 weeks braced for the hearing, and I had imagined that the other side of it would feel like something, relief or triumph, or at least the sensation of a weightlifting. What I actually felt was something quieter and harder to name, like the end of a very long argument that should never have happened. I drove to my grandmother's house. My house now, though that still felt like a word in the wrong language. I had a key. I had always had a key. I let myself in through the back, the way I always did, and I stood in her kitchen. The light through the window over the sink was that particular winter afternoon gray. The rosemary plant on the sill was still alive. Petra had been watering it. I sat down at the kitchen table and I did not do anything for a while. I just sat there in the way you sit somewhere that holds a person you loved. After a while, I got up and I put on her kettle. I made tea. I found the folder where she kept her recipes, her actual recipes, handwritten on index cards in that looping cursive, and I sat back down and I went through them one by one. Her mother's apple cake, her own biscuit recipe which had 4 more steps than any biscuit recipe needs and which produced the best biscuits I have ever eaten. A card for something labeled only "The Good Cookies," which made me laugh out loud alone in that kitchen, which felt like exactly the right response. I was still sitting there when my phone rang. It was Brett. I looked at his name on the screen for a moment. I let it ring. He called again the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 4th day, I picked up. I let him say what he needed to say, the explanation, the context, the walk back of various things, the careful repositioning of himself as someone who had just been scared and not himself and who was really, underneath it all, my brother. When he finished, I said, "Brett, I'm going to need some time." He asked how much time. "I don't know yet," I said. "I'll let you know." The honest answer is that I still don't know. It has been 8 months. I have been learning the business. There are parts of it that are harder than I expected and parts of it that feel, surprisingly, like home. The operations director, a woman who has been with Aldertons for 18 years and who makes it her business to know everything about everything, sat down with me in my first week and said, "Your grandmother talked about you a lot. She said you would know what to do, but that you would need about 6 months to believe it." She smiled. She was usually right about these things. I kept the bakery open. I hired a manager to run the day-to-day in Asheville while I spent time in Wilmington learning the business my grandmother built. I go back to Asheville most weekends. The garage still smells like brown butter. The cardamom tarts are on the permanent menu now. My parents have not called. I am not sure what I would say if they did. I used to think I would have a lot to say, years of it, carefully organized. Now I think the honest answer is that I don't have much to say at all. Not because I have forgiven them exactly, but because I have run out of the specific kind of energy that anger requires, and what's underneath it is not pain anymore. It is just distance. Clean distance. I drove through Charlotte last month on my way back from a vendor meeting. I took the exit I grew up on, more out of muscle memory than intention. The houses in that neighborhood are exactly as large as I remembered them. The lawns are still perfect. Everything still looks right on the outside. I did not stop. I did not stop. I did not slow down even. I just drove through and kept going, and by the time I reached the on-ramp, the neighborhood was behind me and I was thinking about the cardamom tart recipe and whether I should try a brown sugar variation, and my grandmother's voice in my head saying, "Real is the real thing." She was right. She was always right about the things that mattered. I am learning to trust that I am too. I have thought a lot about what actually happened in that courtroom in February, not the legal part, the human part. The part where my mother sat across the table and watched 30 years of a particular story she had told herself get quietly dismantled by a visitor log and an email she had forgotten she sent. The thing about the email is that she wrote it without any awareness that it would ever matter. She wasn't being careless. She just never imagined a version of events where I ended up on the other side of discovery. She had calculated the odds of that and found them negligible. That was the error. Not the greed exactly, but the certainty. The absolute, unquestioned certainty that she knew how the story ended. My grandmother knew something different. Frances had watched people make that particular mistake her entire life. The mistake of confusing noise with substance, of confusing a loud claim with a real one. She built a company in an era when nobody was handing women with folding tables and a station wagon anything, and she did it by being very clear-eyed about what was real and what was performance. She saw right through performance. She had been seeing through it for 50 years by the time she saw through my mother's. What I keep coming back to is this. Nobody handed Frances anything either. And she did not give me this company because I was her granddaughter. She gave it to me because she had watched me do the same thing she had done. Build something from nothing, quietly, without anyone's permission or encouragement, in a converted garage in a city where nobody knew my last name. She recognized it. That's what the letter said, really. She recognized what building actually looks like, and she recognized it in me, and she wanted to make sure it was protected. I think about the choices my mother and brother made. Not with anger anymore, but with genuine curiosity. They had every opportunity to show up. They had 4 years of Sundays. They had phone calls they could have returned, visits they could have made, questions they could have asked. They chose not to, and then they chose to blame the person who did. That sequence of choices had a consequence, and the consequence was entirely predictable. Not because the universe was keeping score, but because Frances was. She was watching, and she was specific, and she drew the only conclusion the evidence supported. That is the part that I want to carry forward. Not the inheritance, the lesson underneath it. That character is not what you claim about yourself in a conference room. It is what you do on an ordinary Wednesday when nobody is watching and there is nothing obvious to gain. It is whether you show up for the people who need showing up for. It is whether the work you do is real. My grandmother drove product in a station wagon with a broken AC. I baked until 2 in the morning in a dormitory kitchen and hoped someone would eat it. Neither of us waited for permission or recognition. We just kept going because the work itself was worth doing. Brett asked me once how much time I needed. I told him I didn't know yet. That is still true. What I know is that time is not the real variable. The real variable is whether anything changes, whether the people who made choices that hurt start making different ones, not for strategic reasons, but because something in them actually shifts. I cannot control that. I can only control what I build next, and who I choose to be while I'm building it. Frances said I was almost at the point of not needing other people to tell me it was going to be okay. I think I am there now. Maybe that is the whole inheritance. The money and the company are real, and I am grateful for them. But the thing she gave me that matters most is the proof that she saw me clearly and that what she saw was enough. That is what I am carrying forward. That is what I am building on.